Today we're going to check out the Flashforge Adventurer 3. Just a note before we get started today, this will be the last video for what I'm calling Season 3 of Chris's Basement. We got a lot done over the last year, but it is time for summer break. So I'll be taking the next couple of weeks off. I'm not going to be releasing any new videos, but I will be doing some live streams, and I will be back in just a couple of weeks with a lot more content. Now to the printer. The Adventurer 3 is a fully enclosed 3D printer from Flashforge, a Far East company in China that's been around the 3D printing scene since about 2011. It has a 150mm cubed build volume. It does come with a heated bed with a removable steel sheet. It has a removable extruder head, which we'll go over here in just a little bit. It is a Bowden style setup. It does have filament runout. It has a built-in camera, as well as a web server to view it while it's printing. It has an interesting built-in filament cartridge holder. We'll go over all of that as we go through the different specs of the machine. But it has a lot of the features that you would expect for a 3D printer to have in the market today. And these did come out in 2019. There's been a lot of reviews on them already. Fun fact, Joel Telling did a review on this machine. And in that review, he was wearing a Chris's Basement shirt. Now, after testing this machine, as a 3D printer, this one pretty much does everything you're going to need it to do, and it has a lot of nice-to-have features. But Flashforge does have their own slicer that they intend for you to use while using their 3D printers, and it's called FlashPrint. So a lot of this review is going to be circling around their software that they pair with their machines, and some of the struggles that I had using it. But as always with these reviews, I like to start with all the things that I like about the machine. So let's just start with the aesthetics of this machine. I really like the way the printer looks. There's a lot of see-through panels. It is an all-injection molded enclosure. It has a nice door on it with hinges. You have magnets to keep it locked in place. And the way this printer looks, I think, really adds to the value of the printer. You can pretty much put this thing anywhere, and it's not going to look that much out of place. The enclosure is going to be really helpful when you're printing certain materials like ABS. Also, for younger users, this is going to keep a lot of hands out of here while it's working, and should be just a lot safer all around. Flashforge has this door where you can store your filament. You can put a small spool of filament in here, it feeds up into the extruder, and it does have a filament runout sensor. The only problem is you can only use these small spools. You can get these from a few different manufacturers, but they're not really all that common. Of course, there are a lot of users out there that have created parts so that you can use any spool that you wish. It kind of leans them out to the side to feed it in, or you can use an external spool holder. But to keep going with that aesthetic appeal of this machine, it would be nice if you could put a spool in there and close this door to keep things looking as clean as possible. It is compatible with any filament. There's no chipping or barcoding with any of these spools, so that's nice to hear. But a little more versatility with what kind of spool you'd like to use, that'd be nice to see, so you could use this nice door and keep everything looking nice and clean. We'll kind of start in the back here, but you do have access to an Ethernet port if you wish to use it. It is also completely Wi-Fi. We'll look at that further. Also, one of the features that's kind of easy to miss is this fan right here. This enclosure fan is actually controllable through your G-code, so you don't have to have it on all the time if you're printing something like ABS. You do have your heated bed with your removable sheet. It's got a BuildTak-like sheet on top. It's important to remember if you're doing something like PETG or flexible, which this machine doesn't actually state that it does, but I did test PETG. It works pretty well. You want to put some glue stick down on this so you don't rip a hole in it. It does stick really well to ABS and PLA. It's just kind of spring-loaded. It goes right in here and clicks in place. And here's what the bed looks like when it's set to about 100 C. It's getting really close to 100. It takes a little bit for it to get there. But in between the center and the edges of the bed, we're seeing about a 10-degree difference. But that's not the worst that I've ever seen, even on the small beds like this one. When the bed's at 100 and you close the door on the enclosure, it does keep it fairly warm in there, and it heats it fairly quickly. You do have your removable print head. You can push these clips in and just pull out the whole cartridge. I really didn't have to mess with that at all. And it does have part cooling, although the fan is not very large. I did see a bit of stringing on some of the prints. You can lower the filament temp to get rid of that, but a little bit more part cooling couldn't hurt anything. The bottom case is all metal, and to get back to the bed for a second, it actually rides on one smooth rod on this side, and then it has a roller on this side, so you can actually lift it a bit. Now, I really didn't have a whole lot of issues leveling this because it's such a small build area. It does have an auto leveling sequence, but it just touches the center of the bed. By default, Flashprint prints with a raft, and I think that's how they're getting around a lot of these inconsistencies. I was able to complete some leveling prints. They're not extremely accurate, but again, at a 150 build volume, it's not going to be that big of a deal. You should be able to get it adjusted just once with that leveling sequence and go on from there. And to continue on with aesthetics, we'll take a look at the touchscreen. The touchscreen is fairly straightforward. You can print in a couple different modes. You can upload to the printer wirelessly, you can use a USB flash drive, or you have some cloud options. You can use the Flashforge cloud or the Polar cloud. But to print, you just have a build button. You can pick whichever you would like. There will be some cloud options down here if you've gone through the setup. But you have onboard memory, and then you have your USB memory. If you load a USB stick, it's actually going to copy that G-code file onto the onboard memory before it starts printing it. But you can go into the onboard memory, and here are all your files. If you'd like to print a file, you can just hit play, and the print will take off. But you can also click on the icon, and there's a preview of that file. This is something you're starting to see more and more as the 32-bit boards come out. They have more support for features like this, but you can select to build it, throw it away. It's going to give you an estimate of how long it's going to take. This is the Maker's Muse tolerance test, but it's kind of nice to have that preview just so you know what you sliced and what you're getting ready to print. From there, you can just hit build and the print will take off. In the tools menu, there's not a whole lot here. You can set up your wireless network, do some preheating, find out a little bit of information about the printer, and there are a few additional settings. This is where you're going to find calibrate, you can home the machine, you can get some stats, you can move the printer around manually, you can change how your camera is viewed, you can change up your sounds, you can do a factory reset, and you can also update the firmware. It's important to note in the couple of months that I've had this machine, I've already had 2 firmware updates. So it's nice to see Flashforge is still developing their firmware. And not too much in here. You can hit the filament button, you can load it or change it. It takes a couple minutes to do each, but it goes through the whole cycle of heating up, pulling it in, doing all the things you need to do. It's going to give you all the information on how to do it right here on the screen. So there's a lot of features on this printer that I like, especially the way it looks. I think it's a nice looking machine. But as I said before, as a 3D printer, it does its job. There's not a long list of cons that I could give you, the things that I don't like about the machine. A few little things here and there that are irritating, like that bed leveling sequence. It takes a bit to get it just right, but it is workable. I did struggle, however, while testing it. So I thought the easiest way to convey that to you is to just walk you through it step by step. The first thing we did was unbox it on a live stream, print a Benchy. There were no problems with that at all. But then I started testing a few things. So let's go over it. So after the Benchy test, I went to the Octopus. This red filament is the stuff that came with the printer on that smaller spool, and you'll notice a couple of its tentacles didn't quite stick. The print did complete, but parts of it were coming off the build plate while other parts won't. Again, that leveling feature was suspect. I reran the leveling feature and I brought it all the way down to a post-it, and then I backed it up 1 notch and reran in this orange filament, and this one came out successfully. Now since that first level, I haven't had to redo anything, but I did want to check to see just how level it was. So I ran these 2 leveling tests. These are Tom's tests. You'll notice the T is all messed up here in the corner. That's because that back left corner is actually just a little bit lower than the rest of the bed. You can see where the filament didn't lay down back there. Even on the smaller leveling test. Then I went up to the bigger one just to see what would happen. Pretty much the same thing. That T on the back is kind of messy. So pretty much what you're left with to get decent prints most of the time is you're going to have to lower that calibration test down lower than you think you should. That's going to allow you to compensate for any low spots. You might get some extruder clicking on the higher spots, however. But to remedy this whole thing, by default in Flash Print, Flashforge wants you to use a raft, which nowadays is kind of unheard of. So you really don't have a lot of option here. You have to lower it enough where it's going to stick, but it might cause issues in other areas if the bed isn't level. But after that, I moved on to some other prints. I did try the Maker's Muse tolerance test. We got 0.5 and 0.4, but we could not get 0.3. This is just some generic PLA. If I really forced it, I might be able to get that to move. But as far as accuracy goes, not that great. Remember, I am using the default Flashforge profiles that they give you at this point. I'm trying to use the printer as they intend for you to use it. Then we went to the lattice torture cube. You can see some inconsistency in here, but it completed first time out, no problem at all. It doesn't lay things down as accurately as it should sometimes, especially when moving from point to point like on the cube. And you'll see more of that on a couple of the other models. I did a vase mode print. This thing came out great. I had a whole bunch of extra red filament, so I actually maximized the build volume and printed out this cube. It is 150 cubed, and it came out really well. I did a couple of these test prints. I wanted to try out that filament runout sensor, so I let it go ahead and run out of red, and then I switched to this purple. For some reason, this purple filament is really stringy. It's a generic PLA of some kind. It's the only filament I've had do this, so I definitely think it's the filament and not the printer. But other than the strings, everything seems to look pretty good. And then we get into the first Adelinda that I tried, and this is where things start to get really interesting. You'll notice some really wicked layer shift there at the top. Also, both of her front feet are broke off. This is where I really had to start looking at that default profile that Flashforge gives you and start making some changes. You'll also notice on her tail, there's a lot of inaccuracy there. Again, when moving from a different point. So during testing, this is where things start to get a bit interesting. Now I'm on a quest to make a successful Adelinda. I have to get in, make some changes in Flash Print, just to see if I can get rid of that layer shift and the inaccuracies when it goes to the small sections of the print. So let's take a look at Flash Print now. So here's Flash Print. It might be some sort of rebranding of Cura, I'm not sure, but this is what Flashforge uses for their slicer. Adelinda is almost the maximum volume size for the Adventurer 3. It's a pretty good test model anyway. It has a lot of small features, so I just loaded it up, and then I went up here and hit print. And I started looking through a lot of the features. So because I was getting inaccuracies when moving from different locations of the print, like when you're making the feet, it moves from the body to the foot to try to make that small circle and then back again, I went ahead and lowered the speed. So base print speed, I went down to 60, and then travel speed, I brought it down to 70. And then I tried again. So we did better this time. We didn't have a real catastrophic layer shift, but we had a couple, including ones on the legs. So at this point, I was going through different settings, different sizes, thinking maybe it was something at a certain height of the model. I was still getting layer shifting. None of the feet would turn out correctly. I tried a ton of different times trying to get the perfect settings dialed in. And you'll notice almost always the feet and the tail would break. So the settings that I ended up with, I went to the base print speed of 50. I lowered travel to 60. On the perimeters, I went all the way up to 4. This is the shell thickness that I found that allowed me to do those small areas like the legs and tail without them breaking. I had supports and raft turned off. That's not necessary with PLA on this machine. Your part cooling is always on. You really can't set that much. You can set the delayed cooling so it'll slow down the layers if it needs more time, but not really the fan speed. And then from default in advanced, I changed up the path width to 0.42 to give me just a bit more layer. And the extrusion ratio is actually trying to do the same thing. I just swapped it to the opposite way. I lowered mine down to 100%. Same with the first layer. The first layer extrusion, lowering that percentage, also helped with the extruder skipping if the layer was just a little bit too close to the bed in certain spots. And these are the final settings that I went with to get my good Adelinda print. And here's what we came up with. Again, that purple filament was kind of stringy, but I didn't break any of the feet. All the layers look pretty good, and I have a nice and sturdy tail. So lowering the speed, upping the shell count, enabled me to get my successful Adelinda print. So feeling pretty good with Adelinda, I moved on to my castle print. I test a lot of these. Again, with that same purple filament, it is kind of stringy, but all the towers look good. It looks pretty precision. Not near as messy as I was seeing before I tweaked those slicer settings. So I'm pretty happy with my PLA at this point. But this is an enclosed printer. What about ABS? Well, I pulled out some really old gray ABS filament that I had. I believe it was Inland brand, and I ran a couple of benchies. And honestly, this is probably one of the best ABS benchies that I've ever printed. That overhang can be a real challenge with ABS because you're not using fan, of course. But with that ABS filament, I'd say this print came out pretty nice overall. So I definitely trust it to print some ABS. I did, however, print all the ABS prints on a raft. Here's my second Benchy, just so I can show you it is consistent. The quality is pretty much the same as the first one, but the raft that it does print is pretty easy to get off. A lot of times these can be a real challenge. For the most part, this just came off in a couple of sections, and the bottom of the print actually looked pretty good. There's a little cleanup to be done, but sometimes these things can be stuck on really tight, and having a raft that you can't get off is pretty much useless. I did try one of the castle prints in that same gray ABS, but I think I flew just a little bit too close to the sun on that one. And during the PLA test, I did print a calibration cube. I don't print a lot of these, but I found this one that I kind of liked. And the test came out fairly well. So as far as dimensional accuracy, I'm pretty happy with that. So after tweaking the profile a bit, I was pretty happy with my PLA results on a lot of the different models that I tried. Slowing it down did increase my accuracy, and I was able to increase the strength a bit, so I could complete a lot of them successfully. But now I wanted to move on to PETG. And Flashforge doesn't mention anything about PETs in their advertisements or on the front of the printer. But that's one of the more common filaments nowadays, so I definitely wanted to give it a try. So I loaded up a printed solid stud layers a lot with some Green Gate filament PETG, and I set it to 240, 85 on the bed. And this type of model, where it's all one piece, it doesn't have to move around to a lot of different locations, doesn't have a lot of small perimeters, small areas to print, it did just fine. I did forget to take the raft off in the slicer settings, but no big deal. But it handled the PETG like a champ. But when testing PETG, I usually like to print some small case, like this one for a Raspberry Pi Zero. PETG works really good if you can snap the pieces together because it has just enough flex to be able for you to do that. And when I tried this out, the top of the case, not so good. We were actually missing some filament in the corner, and it didn't cover over the infill very well. And the lid, where you have these ears that actually snap down onto the body, they didn't come out hardly at all, as well as the pegs where your Zero would mount. So that's not going to do. So at this point, I really wasn't happy with PETG, and I went through all the same tests, trying to find a slicer profile in Flashprint that would work successfully for PET filaments. And it's important to note that the max temp on this machine for the hot end is 240 and the bed is 100. And there's some PETs out there that you're probably not going to be able to print all that well at 240. This is a lower temp PET, so we should be good there, but I still couldn't get a successful print. But I found a trick, and that's what I'm going to show you now. Flipping through Reddit, I found this post, and a user had set up Cura with all the right start and end G code so that he could use Cura on his Flashforge printer. So I went ahead and tried it out. In Cura, if you go set up a custom FFF printer, you can just enter those start and end G code commands right in here. Make sure you have it set to Marlin. It is 150 cubed. And make sure your origin is at center. I'm not exactly sure what the Flashforge printer does or the software inside it that makes you have to do this, but if you don't, it's going to put your model all the way to the corner. But that's the fix for that. And I did have a pretty successful print. But why stop there? I use Prusa Slicer more often. In Prusa Slicer, I did the same thing, custom G code. I entered the same start and end G code that I did in Cura, right from that Reddit post. I'll leave a link to that, by the way. It's also important to note that we're using an M907 command right here. That would normally, in firmware like Marlin, set your current for your stepper motors. I'm not sure if this is actually compatible with an Adventurer 3. On some of the Flashforge printers, you can set that current setting in Flashprint if you're seeing issues. But when you select the Adventurer 3, those options go away. But it doesn't hurt to try just to add it in here in our Start G code. And then in the General tab, we'll just go into Bed Shape, and I set my origin to 7575 so that it will once again be in the center of the bed. And you can just go ahead and export your G code. You will need to save it as a .g file. You can just punch that in by hand and hit save. And back to Flashprint, one of the handiest features about Flashprint is that you can connect up to your printer wirelessly. If you just go to Tools, we'll go to Machine Information, It's going to scan your network for a Flashforge printer. This is mine right here. You set up that Wi-Fi when you start the printer at the beginning. I do that in the live stream. We'll just hit connect. It's going to give you all the information about your printer and its status. And you can send your G-code over to your printer right from here. That's probably one of the handiest things about this printer. But if you don't want to use FlashPrint for your slicing, you can just hit load and then find that .g file that you created in your other slicer, this one right here, and hit open. And it'll bring your G-code right in here, and then you can go ahead and just hit send, and it'll send it on over to your printer ready to print. Now some of the settings don't look quite right when you do it like this, but it does print successfully on the printer. You do lose your cool icon on the printer screen, but I actually had more success on some of the prints slicing in Cura and in Prusa Slicer than I did with FlashPrint. And while we're talking about FlashPrint, I mentioned that this printer has a built-in camera. If you go to your printer's IP and then port 8080, action stream, and then while you're printing, you have a live stream that you can watch to see how your print's doing. Now it is in kind of a weird position, but for the most part, it does just fine. And after switching to the other slicers, I started to get some decent results with PETG. They're not great by any means. These little pegs are really small to print, but the case does now snap together. So we're moving in the right direction. There is some work to do, but I found that a pretty cool feature that you could actually use another slicer on this printer. So after changing up some of the slicer settings, getting the filament tuned in, and using another slicer on this machine, I was pretty happy overall with some of the print results that I was seeing. I think the biggest downside to this machine is the FlashPrint software and the fact that this machine runs proprietary firmware. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I thought it would be fun to at least take a look and see what mainboard they're running. I'm not familiar with this board at all. It is something completely different than what I've used before. It does have a few empty plugs on it where you could probably plug some other stuff in, but it does have an ARM-based processor. You can kind of see it there in the middle. I don't know my models of ARM chip that well, but you could look it up just to see exactly which one it is. If we pull back a bit, there's the whole board. You can see our Wi-Fi module down here. It does have an antenna on it. And we have our 4 stepper drivers over here, as well as our MOSFETs. Those do appear to be TMC 2208 drivers, hence why the printer is so quiet. And we can take a look at how loud the machine is while it's printing. Most of this is actually fan noise. Also nice to see while I was in here, this is pretty much the only compartment that you can do anything with. The rest of it's sealed up, but they do use a Delta power supply. It's good to see a name brand supply. So now you've seen the printer. After weeks of testing, dozens of test prints, and at this price point, Flashforge does sell these for $450 US on their site. Would I personally buy this 3D printer? Me? No. Not that there's anything wrong with the printer, I just like to have a little bit more control. I'm used to a rip-rap style environment where I can tweak the firmware and upgrade things and do modifications, and on a printer like this, that's going to be pretty hard to do. But if you're a new user to 3D printing and you want to get set up and printing quickly, or maybe you're a younger user that needs a few more safety features in your environment, this might be one of the printers to look at. I also think if you're doing a lot of ABS prints that are relatively small, this should make them repeatable over and over, so you don't have to go buy the printer, buy an enclosure, or make one, and then add your nice-to-have features. It's all wrapped up in one package for a decent price. And it's going to get you set up and printing quickly, and that's one of the main features a new user is going to want. I am looking forward to seeing what Flashforge does with their slicer and their firmware going forward. They are well on their way to having an ecosystem that works well on their machines. It just needs to be pushed a little further. Flashforge did provide this printer for the purpose of this review. No money has exchanged hands, and all opinions expressed are my own. Hopefully you liked this video or you found it helpful. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to my channel. If not, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I will see you all in a couple of weeks, and as always, thanks for watching.